Hello Animals fans and welcome back to AniLysis. Today we're looking at Cassie's father. He's called Walter. I've got a picture of him here. This was AI generated based on, well, these quotes. He was a male, as all human fathers are. His hair was dark brown, but it seemed to have been removed from much of his head. He wore round transparent lenses on his face, which, I am told, are for correcting faulty vision. His complexion is darker. He had the usual number of arms and legs. Rachel looked down at my father's own jeans. They ended about 6 inches above his shoes, revealing socks that didn't exactly match. "Gee, I wonder where Cassie gets it from," Rachel said dryly. Thump, thump, thump. Eric grabbed my shoulder and pointed into the barn. A dark shadow moved closer. It was my dad thumping through the barn in his clunky work boots. Walter is Cassie's father. He's a black chap. He's got the specs. He's got dark brown hair, always black, but his hair's receding. It's a bit like mine, really, embarrassingly enough. You and I, Walter, we're somewhat alike in that regard. So, and his clothes as well. So, very much like Cassie, his sense of style leaves much to be desired, according to Rachel anyway, but then she probably thinks that about most people. So I've done him up here in a sort of unironed checkered shirt, the sort of thing that you'd expect someone of his background probably to wear, you know, lives out in a rural area, in a barn, and I just, maybe it's a stereotype, but I assume people who do that sort of thing have checkered shirts. I've got a few checkered shirts, but not that sort of checkered shirt. It looks a bit... Actually, it's not a bad shirt, really. But you can imagine if I did a full AI picture of him, he'd have these big, bulky work boots that he stomps around in, and his clothes don't exactly fit. Yeah, I think this is... AI's done a good job here, and you'll see in this picture that he's in front of a big red barn and an old 90s, I think that must be early then. It's an old American pickup truck. And it's a large part of his character, actually. But before we move on to that sort of side of things, let's just look at this guy's personality. What is the biggest thing we are given about Cassie's father? Cassie's parents are vets. The only people I know who like animals and animal documentaries more than Cassie does. This chap is wild about wildlife. He's got a big old barn, and we'll learn what goes on in that barn in a minute. Don't worry, it's nothing sinister. And he spends all his life basically caring for animals. A very noble cause, and he's a very noble chap. And it says even more so than Cassie, who we know, she's the animorph who loves animals. She's all about saving the planet and all that sort of stuff. But he's... according to Marco, the way Marco sees it, Cassie's dad's even more into it. It's like he spends his entire time doing it. But that doesn't mean he's this sort of awkward person. You know that sort of person who only ever does one thing ever. And they're not quite so socially there, you know. He's actually a very fun-loving and happy clappy chappy. Let's have a look at his brighter side, his, you know, get up and go, let's make a good joke about this sort of thing side. His happy side. "Where have you been?" my dad asked me when I finally got back home later that evening. He was in the kitchen, searching the refrigerator. It kind of took me by surprise. My parents don't usually ask me a lot of questions. Mostly they trust me, and it used to be that they could trust me. I don't think I'd lied to my parents before becoming Animorph. Now, it's like I'm lying all the time. It's a rotten feeling. "Oh, I was just out walking," I said. "Why? Do you need me for something?" "Oh, yes," my dad said. He was sounding way too solemn, so I knew he wasn't actually serious. That's the way he is. I guess he has a dry sense of humour. That's what Jake says, anyway. He thinks my dad is the funniest man on the planet. "Rachel can stay with me," Cassie said. "I know my mum and dad wouldn't mind." Cassie's mum and dad are about the coolest parents you'll ever find. She grabbed her coffee cup and took a swallow. I remembered the day she got that cup. She and my dad and I were at the amusement park of the gardens. They have one of those photo booths where you get your face put onto another body. We decided on all three of us as supermodels. My mum thought it was so hilarious she had it put on a cup. She and I always teased my dad about how he was the prettiest of the three of us. He'd always laugh and give us these outrageous beauty tips. So Walter is, well, according to Jake, the funniest man on the planet. He's pretty cool, he's pretty chill. And we all know somebody like that, don't we? The sort of person who just seems to go through life with a smile on their face everywhere they go, and you just think, how are you doing that? Why are you such a happy-go-lucky chappy? And that's what he is. He brings a smile everywhere he goes, and he just comes across as a pretty cool dude. But it's obviously not all sunshine and rainbows, you know, not everybody's perfect, and Walter does have his flaws. For one thing, he seems to have slopey shoulders. Just got a call from the highway patrol. They said this certain animal is out by the side of the highway, where it cuts through the forest. They say this certain animal seems to have a bad burn. We have to drive out and get it, my dad said. Then he grinned. Actually, I'll drive. You have to get it. I groaned. There was only one animal in all the world my dad was afraid of. He handled foxes and wolves and even bears, but he would not handle this certain animal. Are you telling me it's a skunk? I asked. He nodded. You have such a way with skunks, he said. They like you. Besides, I have to go meet with the board of the Dudette Cat Food Corporation tomorrow. I can't show up smelling like skunk. Walter runs this organisation, the Wildlife Rehabilitation Clinic, basically on his own. But he has Cassie, his young 13 at the start of the series year old daughter. And yet, whenever he gets a bit anxious about something, for example with the skunk, he turns around and says, Cassie, you do it. Even though she's a 13-year-old girl. He's like, I'm not going to put myself in that position. Cassie, get in there. And then she goes. That is a bit slopey shoulders, you know, if you know what that expression means. I'm pretty sure you must do. But yeah, it's not all sunshine and roses with this guy. He's not exactly perfect. And he's also, how do I put this? He's very protective of his daughter. And obviously not in the sort of way where you think, you know, if somebody came along and tried to punch her, you know, you'd get in the way and say, what the hell do you think you're doing? Get out of it. No, in the sort of way where you're protected from the realities of the world. She has babies out there somewhere in the woods. My dad started applying a new bandage. Cassie, you know nature plays rough. But they're too young to survive on their own, aren't they? I can't be sure, he said, not looking at me. It occurred to me then that sometimes maybe he lied to me too, for my own good, or because of what he thought was my own good. They're sitting in some den wondering where their mother is, I said. They'll starve to death, or be eaten by predators. Hand me the scissors, my father said. That is one strange kid, I heard my father mutter. Need to talk to Cassie about that one. That second quote, by the way, was after Walter saw Axe in his human morph in Cassie's barn saying strange things. It does come across as him being unable or unwilling to basically let his daughter experience the real world. On the first part with the skunks thing, she's talking about how, they're alone in the world, and he just completely ignores it. Don't want to hear it. Let's move on this situation. He doesn't want to really talk to her about it. And then obviously with Axe, it's the case of, you know, let her learn on her own that the kid's strange. He wants to pull her aside and talk to her about, your friend's a bit strange, isn't he? Yeah. It's not like an extreme example of overprotective parenting, I'd say, but it is there to a degree. And it becomes more apparent later on. These are just like little clues. But as we get further into the series, we'll see how this overprotective nature really comes to the forefront. But it all seems part of a personality type where he can't really get angry. He doesn't know how to express his negativity. And I think this is another example of it as well. I got home just in time to walk into my living room and realised both my parents were waiting for me. They had their angry parent faces on. Where have you been? My mother demanded. Mum always takes the lead in discipline. She knows my dad will give in too easily. She thinks she's tougher. She thinks that because it happens to be true. I was out with Rachel, I said, more or less truthfully. Out with Rachel doing what? My mum hissed. You missed dinner. It's dark out. You didn't tell us where you were going. We were very worried, my father said in a soft, quiet voice. He seems to find it very difficult to express his disciplinary side, whereas Cassie's mother takes more of that role. And I compare this to myself and my wife. I compare it to me and my wife because it's the opposite. And we've agreed this. We've had this discussion, and eventually we do plan to have a kid. And we've had the discussion of, right, how is discipline going to be handled? And I said to her, you can't do it. Because I've seen her interact with the cats. And she can't do the shouting. She can't do it. It's just like, come on. There needs to be a level of discipline. And so we've decided I am the one. And I think we see this in a lot of families as well, where, and I think it's usually the mum as well, not always, but sometimes, or mostly, where they will do like the low to mid tier discipline stuff, the low to mid tier chastising. I'll say, you need to do the dishes, or you need to mop the floor, or why are you late from school or whatever, late to school. But then once it gets to high tier, like, why did you set that car on fire? That's when Mr. Discipline comes in, or Mrs. Discipline. That's when the kid knows, oh, damn it, I've really titted up now. Yeah, you need that. You need that. You need the general discipline, but then you need the big red button where the kid will say, hold on a minute, he's disciplining me. I must really be in it this time. That's when you know you've really cocked up. And in this case, it looks like Cassie doesn't really have that, because the dad sits there as if he were that big red panic button, but we never actually, it doesn't come across as him doing that. But then again, she's like an A grade sort of student. She probably doesn't set any cars on fire, to be honest. She would probably think it was environmentally unfriendly, you know. What I'm basically saying is Big Daddy Walter doesn't have the discipline aspect down. He's too nice, he's too friendly, he's too chill. He's like my wife. I wouldn't expect her to do the discipline because she can't. She's just incapable. Just like old Walter here. Let's see how he reacts when he's got bad news for Cassie. This news story. A leopard's escaped from some fool who keeps exotic animals. They think it may have made it back up into the mountains. Clawed a man pretty badly. It'll be a tough job recapturing a leopard. Honey? He yelled in a louder voice directed toward the kitchen. Cassie's home. My dad seemed way too perky. Way too cheerful. It was an act. I went into bright light and gleaming linoleum. Hi, Mum. Hi, sweetheart, my mum said. Now my radar really tingled. My mother isn't one of those honey sweetheart kind of people. Something was wrong. I felt my dad coming into the kitchen behind me. He's putting on an act. Again, he's unable to show the correct emotion. It's like he has only cheerful, optimistic option at this stage in the series. That's all he has. That's all he experiences. That's all he's done going through life. It's just been happy smiles all the way. Of course, when we get to the end of the series, that all comes crashing down. We will see that happen. But yeah, up to this point in his life, it's all been so cheery-deary. So he never has to press that big red button. He never has to express those negative emotions in such a way. And that's just how it appears. Let's have a look at the few times he does get frustrated by people around him, to the point where he's annoyed. What does he do then? It was the aliens, Crazy Helen interrupted. They have these exploding rocks and they spread around out there. Boom! My father rolled his eyes. We're on the edge of an Air Force facility. They have a base way back in the drylands. You see the jets flying over all the time. I suspect they may have lost a bomb or a missile or something. That snake-bit horse must have set it off. The blast caught you. That sounds logical, I said. This was low-level annoyance from Crazy Helen, and Walter just sort of rolls his eyes like that. We also see there he's very logical-minded. Just adding that in there, you know. We will see again later, he's not a religious chap, so he's very much, you know, physical reason, you know, this is the thing in front of me and that's how it is. He's got that sort of thing going on. Which is weird, because Cassie always comes across as the most spiritual character in the series. And yet, apparently her parents are just like, nah, none of that. But yeah, so low-level annoyance from Crazy Helen, he just rolls his eyes. Let's see what happens when he confronts Axe and Humamorph. We covered it slightly earlier. This is before he says, that kid is strange. This is the lead-up to that. Who, Axe? Sure, he's fine, Jake said. He's just from a different country. I groaned. Oh no, now my dad will ask. Oh, that's very interesting. Axe? What country are you from? I am from the Republic of Ivory Coast. Oh man, I moaned. Why did I ever give him the World Almanac? You know, if you don't mind me saying so, you don't look like you'd be from the Ivory Coast, my father said. He was getting that edge he gets in his voice when someone is slowly but surely beginning to grind his last nerve. How about Equatorial Guinea? The Republic of Kyrgyzstan? Canada? Tell you what, my father said. Let's just go with Canada. I am from Canada. I am Canadese. Well, I think old Axe is handling that pretty well, Marco said brightly. You'd never guess he was an alien. An idiot, maybe. Alien? No. How about if you kids just go on home? I'll tell Cassie you came by. Leave? Jake asked, sounding panicked. Yes, leave. My father said in his deep, this is your father talking and I've taken all I'm going to take voice. We never see this guy flip his lid or blow his top throughout the series. But this is as close as we get, where he just gets like that voice on where he's like, well, I'm not very happy right now. That's it, that's as far as he goes. Again, this guy just doesn't show that negativity very much at all. But let's move on from that now. That's about as much personality we get from him until the very end of the series, but we're going to cover that at the end. Let's now move on to his occupation. What does Walter do? Her father and mother are both veterinarians. The wildlife rehabilitation clinic is just my dad and me. We take in injured birds and animals and try to save them, then release them back into their natural habitats. He takes in all kinds of injured wildlife and sets their broken legs and heals their mange and soothes their burns and disinfects their bites. I help him out after school and on weekdays. Mostly I do things like give the animals their meds, that's medications. I wash the animals in their cages and feed them and change dressings and help my dad out in surgery. He's teaching me how to suture. You know, how to make stitches after you perform surgery. I'd help my dad with amputations. A deer, a coyote, a raccoon, all hit by cars. Rachel is going to the mall, I told him. Please make her go with me, Rachel begged my father. He laughed. Nope, sorry Rachel, I need Cassie. Crazy Helen called and we have a sick horse waiting on the edge of the drylands. I headed to the corner of the barn, where my dad has a little workbench. He's not Joe Carpenter, but he did go through a spell where he was really into making birdhouses. Plus, he makes cages sometimes, and does repairs around the barn, so we had a decent selection of tools. I knew my dad had most of the stuff I would need for the tree gland surgery in the operating room, but I didn't think he'd have anything I could use to cut through Axe's skull. My dad's a great vet, but he doesn't saw through bone much. He was laid out on the stainless steel table Cassie's dad used to perform operations. Walter runs and works at the wildlife rehabilitation clinic / centre, depending on which book you read. And he answers calls and goes out, like with the skunk kits and the horse, the snake bit horse with Crazy Helen. He travels out, collects animals and brings them back, and then eventually, once they've been mended, not the right word for it, he releases them back to where they came from. So that's effectively what he does. He doesn't do it on pets, it's all wild animals. So he'll get a call, "Hey up mate, this woodlouser's just broken a leg." And he'll go out, pick it up, take it back, put it on his stainless steel operating table. Then he'll build a cage with his workbench, put the animal in there, and then once it's recovered, out it goes. That seems to be the basics of how his little operation runs. Also, I think it's interesting there that he used to try to make birdhouses. That's a neat little thing to throw in there. He does come across as the sort of guy who'd do that in his spare time when there's like no animals that he needs to tend to. He'd be like, "I'm gonna make some bird boxes." Yeah, sounds about right really. Now, he spends a lot of time in this place, and it does become a bit of an inconvenience for our friendly Animorphs team. "Okay," Marco said. "We need a place to keep him." "We can't use anyone's home," Cassie said, thinking aloud. "We can't use my barn. My dad is in and out of there constantly." I checked my watch. Time was running out. My parents would be home soon. First thing my dad would do was come to the barn. We were not in the barn. Cassie's father would be working there during the day. We were in the woods near Tobias's meadow. This is relevant to the story, and it's basically all Walter does for the first 48 books of the series. With a couple of exceptions, but basically he is there as an obstacle. We'll cover more of that in a bit when we get to talking about the story of Walter. Let's just take a look at the other thing that is required for running his business. He can't just be stuck in this thing all day. He's got to do stuff external as well. My dad muttered, The pet food company that's been paying to support the clinic is pulling out. I'm trying to get a new company to help us out, but it doesn't look good. It looks like we're going to have to shut down the clinic." I should have had something to say. They were both looking at me like I'd have something to say, but I just didn't. "We know this will upset you," my mum said, and I just stared blankly. "We'll keep trying," my dad said. "In fact, I'm leaving town tomorrow to talk to a vice president at this new company." Cassie's parents were gone for the day. Her mum was working at the gardens. Her dad was at a vet conference. Because he's a vet, he obviously goes to various conferences because he can't just be completely out of the loop. You know, the animal science changes on like a weekly basis. So he's got to be kept abreast of what is actually going on in the sciences, effectively. So, of course, he's got to go to certain conferences. And it seems to me that his business is grant funded, which a lot of businesses are. Which means he's got to constantly be out there saying, "Give me money, give me money, give me money," which is what the cat food company was doing. My workplace does it. You know, money just doesn't appear out of nowhere. You have to apply for grants, and you do that all the time. Just constantly looking around, right, what grants are there out there? I'm going to apply for that one. Hopefully they'll give me £1,000 over there. Hopefully that one will give me 10,000 over there. And it's a madhouse. Thankfully, it's my boss that does all that sort of stuff and not me. Not yet, anyway. So that's the Wildlife Rehabilitation Centre, and we will cover that in a separate analysis, so I'm not going to delve any further into that necessarily. Let's move on to his relationships, okay? So, what's his relationship with Cassie like? "We have a very cool kid." That kind of gave me a warm feeling. Your parents have to love you, but I felt as if my parents liked me too. As a person. "Yes, we do have a cool kid," my mum agreed. "But on those rare occasions when she screws up, the only way to really discipline her is to embarrass her." They both laughed. "Ha ha ha. Next time we can tell her we're going to have Jake and his parents over to discuss rules for their relationship," my mum said. More laughter. He he he. "Or as a backup plan, we could threaten to take her into Father Benyon for a family discussion about intimacy." That was my dad's suggestion. They say schizophrenia usually appears first during the teen years. I told my mum that once. She said, "Honey, how can anyone tell the difference between a crazy teenager and a regular teenager?" My dad had laughed, then caught himself. "Not that we're saying we expect you to be wild or anything. Let me make that perfectly clear. We're not saying it's okay." "Okay, Dad. I'll stop my wild and crazy ways." They laughed. I laughed. We all knew I was not exactly the definition of a wild and crazy girl. You know the cell phone I'm supposed to take with me for emergencies only? Well, Dad made a deal with me. I can talk for half an hour a week if I do Saturday morning meds. Sweetheart, are you okay? I realised my dad was staring at me. I had been breathing hard, almost crying. We've talked a little bit about how Walter can be very protective of Cassie, and this is another symptom, I believe, of that. Where that you limit the use of your phone to half an hour a week. It seems very extreme, but then again it was the 90s. But then again, I was allowed maybe like an hour of computer a day, which is, you know, still relatively strict, but not as strict as half an hour of, was it half an hour of phone a week? It was something ridiculous like that, wasn't it? What was that? Damn it, I could talk for half an hour a week if yeah, half an hour a week is ridiculous. It's like North Korea. This all adds up to Cassie being a very well behaved but not very adventurous and a bit boring girl. And they admit it. They say, oh, Cassie in her wild, crazy ways, ha ha ha. Oh, all the crazy things she does, ha ha ha. That's basically saying, yeah, our kid's boring as hell. And it's because of their overprotective nature. You haven't let her be exposed to kids like Axe running around. You got to let them experience that. You let them see that and say, right, I don't want to be like that. You know, it's those sorts of things, the interesting things in life that you got to expose yourself to become a bit more interested in yourself. Because if you're never exposed to anything interesting, like if you spend your entire life, extreme example, you spend the first 20 years of your life in a white room with nothing there. You're not going to be a very interesting a person, are you, when you come out of it eventually? In fact, as crazy as it gets is the first quote there, where they're basically saying that their method of discipline is to embarrass her, which is really weird. Although that is sort of a joke, so fair enough, bit of leniency there. But I wouldn't be surprised, honestly, if they thought that discipline just meant embarrassing their kid. I wouldn't be surprised. They don't seem to need to ever discipline her because she's not interesting enough to do anything worth disciplining. And I just thought I'd add that last quote in there where he calls her sweetheart, because we'll talk about his relationship with Cassie, and that's one of his nicknames for her, sweetheart. It's a pretty bog standard one, but a nice one nonetheless. We also see a bit of his relationship with his wife, Michelle, Cassie's mother. Let's have a look at a couple of quotes about that. Cassie, if you hear me, just say okay. Okay, Cassie said. Good luck. Good luck? Cassie's father echoed. We don't need luck. We have your mom. See, I heard my mother say smugly. You were right, as usual, my dad said. It certainly seems to me that Michelle is the one that wears the trousers in this relationship, because at every possible opportunity, Walter just says, you're right, I'm wrong, I'm the man, therefore I should just shut up and know my place. Fair enough, if that's how your relationship works. This also matches up with the idea of her being the main discipliner and him just sitting in a corner not knowing how to raise his voice. It all does fit nicely together. You know, you're a lovely chap, Walter, but grow some balls. He just seems to be a bit of probably a better way of putting it without joking around so much. He comes across as, yeah, he's a bit of a simp, isn't he? A bit of a simp. You're right, honey, you're the greatest. Ha ha, you go. Oh. But bless him, they're in a loving relationship, so whatever works for you, works for you. I'm, you know, I can look at it from my own perspective, but my perspective is only my perspective. Walter, and for a lot of other people, that's the way it works for you, and good on you. So let's now move on to, what was I going to move on to next? Ah, yes, okay. So there are a couple of things before Endgame Animorphs where we see a couple of little traits regarding Walter. And the first is, he's a good cook, bit experimental. She asked me to eat your food. Food. Ooh, duh. Well, someone has to eat it. Might as well be you who suffers. I cooked tonight. Made my world famous chili. Cassie's eyes suddenly widened. She looked frightened. Oh, chili? Jake said he wasn't really hungry. He already ate. Is chili a very frightening food? I asked Cassie. Her father grinned. Mine is. Cassie's mother smiled at Cassie's father. Isn't it just precious the way she tries to protect him? Too late, Cassie's father said. He's trapped now. There is no escape. I used habanero chilies, Cassie's father said. The hottest substance known to man. This was quite a delightful scene from Book 8. Book 8? Where Walter makes his world famous chili. And it's a great little scene, but I'm going to cover that in its own separate analysis, covering Walter's world famous chili. But we'll just leave it at... this wasn't even... Jake wasn't supposed to be there initially. It wasn't as if they'd invited him round and beforehand they said, right, Jake's coming round for dinner, so I'm going to make a really, really hot chili. No, he just did it anyway. Jake just turned up incidentally. Jake wouldn't have been there, and they would have just had this really hot chili, which it seems strange to me because maybe it's just me because you know I'm British and but we don't do that really here. I think in India they probably do it to a certain degree where they deliberately go in for let's go for something massively hot, because over here you just do it sort of ironically. Oh, I'm gonna try the hottest curry there is. Whoa, look at me. That's basically what it is. That's the only reason I've ever eaten hot curry. It's just to be like, oh, look at this. Oh, ah. Sometimes you just got it when you're out on the lash with the lads, don't you? You just got to say, right, what's the hottest curry? Yeah, I can handle it. Where's the asbestos? Where's the asbestos? Nothing. Yeah, he just, on a whim, he's just like, I'm going to make the world's hardest curry. Oh, chili. Good on you, Walter. I like it. I like the the ambition of burning your family's faces off. I appreciate. Not literally. My God, someone will take that out of context, won't they? Oh, he said he'd burn his family's face off. Oh, shut up. Grow up. God. But not only is he a man who loves his chili and his hot food, but he loves his truck. He loves his truck. How do we get there? Cassie demanded. We can't morph and fly over. If we morph here, we'll draw them to my house. She was right, and the houses where the Vlique was headed were half a mile away. Are the keys in that? Marco asked. Cassie and I looked where he was pointing. Cassie's father's beat-up old pickup truck. The truck he used around the farm. No way, Cassie said. Way, Marco said. Which left it up to me to decide. Let's do it. Just don't tell my dad what happened to his truck, she added, forcing a brave laugh. He thinks it was stolen. We'd better leave it at that. We were driving in our new pickup truck. My father's old, beloved pickup truck had been stolen and totally destroyed. My dad cried over the twisted remains of that truck. So Walter has a truck that he drives around on his farm. And there it is. Look at it, beautiful red to match the barn. And he drove that around his farm every day, listening to a Stevie Wonder. Well, actually, yeah, what does he listen to while he's driving on the farm? Let's just quickly cover that before we get into the sad story. On the way, we listened to the CD player. That was the only thing my dad liked about the new truck. He was playing some old jazz or something. I like my dad and all, I really do, but a 2-hour drive with just him and his old Stevie Wonder CDs was not going to be fun. So he goes around in his truck listening to Stevie Wonder and jazz, just doing his farm things, and then suddenly one day Marco comes along, steals the truck and completely totals it. And Walter shed a tear for his beloved pickup truck. R.I.P. Rest in petrol. Young, well, not so young. Old, rusted old pickup truck thing. But alas, he did get himself a second truck, And the truck actually featured quite frequently in the series, so it's going to have its own AniLysis. Both of them. So look forward to them. But yeah, he also listens to jazz music and Stevie Wonder and that sort of stuff. Yeah, I think that's, you know, you think Walter from Animorphs, what would he listen to? Probably jazz music. Who's surprised, honestly? It's hardly going to be Iron Maiden, is it? We've covered most of the basics now. So before we look into the actual story that's relevant to Walter, let's look at some miscellaneous details. Details that didn't quite fit in with the other categories we've covered. My father is one of those people who needs about an hour and 3 cups of coffee to wake up. Why does your dad keep a freezer out here? I asked her. We store stuff in it, Cassie said. She handed me an unidentifiable lump of something. It was frozen solid, so cold my fingers started to ache. Like what? Frozen grubs, Cassie said, leaning back down into the freezer. Certain, bodily fluids from the animals. Oh, and popsicles. Dad likes grape. So we get a good idea of what Walter likes to consume. Firstly, chili and hot stuff, obviously, but then he goes from the hot stuff all the way to the cold stuff at the other end, and he likes grape-flavoured ice lollies. Fair. But, and I did this deliberately, look, in the picture he's holding a coffee mug, because there's quite a few times in the series where he's there holding his coffee. Even when they're in the Hertfordshire Valley, he puts a makeshift one together. He loves his coffee. He's a coffee fiend. He's like me here. Another reason you're like me. Balding and a coffee addict. Not the best traits to share in common, I'll grant you. What are the sort of things that he says? Like, yeah, there's just like habits, voice habits. Is that what you call it? Where you say certain things because that's what you say. Let's just read the quotes. You know, Jake is going to read you the riot act over this, Cassie warned. I laughed. Read the riot act? That's like something my mother would say. What does it even mean? Cassie shrugged and smiled her shy smile. I don't know. My dad says it all the time. I was trying to sound responsible and mature and parental. That's the sound my dad makes when he is examining something interesting. Pa. I don't know why, he just does. And then my dad came home, snapping his fingers and giggling. He lifted me up and twirled me around in a really bad dance. Probably the frog or the twist or whatever. We're saved, he said. Okay, I said. No, we got funding. We got funding. The Wildlife Rehabilitation Clinic is open for business again and back better than ever. Just vocal habits that he has. Read the riot act is a pretty bog standard one, but apparently he says that a lot. He makes weird noises when he's doing certain tasks. And then that last one is basically when he's happy, he comes in clicking his fingers and giggling to himself. Like, maybe not quite like that. But yeah, vocal habits, we'll call it, that section. Well, what if suddenly his mouth was... Cassie looked around the barn, at the animals, her dad's equipment, his small, steady handwriting on the medical charts. He's got steady handwriting. So he's not a messy handwriter. You must think he's probably got quite good cursive. Yeah, pretty good handwriting. Well done, Walter. You get a B+ for that one. What am I doing? What am I saying? I come up with some bollocks, don't I? Blame Medi for that. Medi, that was your fault, that one. It was your fault that my mouth did the thing that it just did. Your fault. Yours. Jesus. That was you as well. You made me freaking... I'm coughing up my guts now. You bastard. You rapscallion, Medi. You'll regret this day that you crossed me and used your Medi powers to make me cough all over the bloody place. Just get on with the freaking video, Adam. Alright, next up. We can assume that he watches the sport ball. So, Jake, you think the Bulls are going all the way again this year? Cassie's father asked. The lights were bright at my house. Through the family room window I could see my mum sitting at her desk going over paperwork. I couldn't see my dad, but I knew where he was. In his big easy chair, watching TV, the remote practically glued to his hand. So if he's sitting in an easy chair, watching TV, and he talks to Jake about the Bulls, I'm assuming he probably watches a lot of sports on television. Probably a bit of a stretch, because just sitting watching TV doesn't automatically mean you're watching sports. I'm just making that connection. That connection of, he clearly knows about the Bulls, which I imagine is some sort of, I don't know, netball team. And, yeah, so he knows what's going on with that, so he must keep up the sports, so he probably watches sports, and he spends all his time in his chair with a remote, probably with a freaking drink in hand. Yeah, that's probably what he does. Couple more miscellaneous points. Let's talk about the skunk spray incident. The source of his fear that we covered earlier. You know, he wanted to slope his shoulder the job of taking care of a skunk to Cassie. Why? Well, it's probably due to this incident. This is pathetic. You guys are both highly trained veterinarians, I pointed out. How can you be scared of skunks? I didn't used to be, my father said darkly. Back before the incident. Just because one skunk sprayed you in the face, he said. Just because you had one bad experience. He sprayed me 6 times in about 3 seconds, he said. I smelled for a week. Your mother made me sleep in the barn, except the other animals there all became agitated, so I had to set up a tent in the yard. Then we had to burn the tent, my mother added. She giggled. There you go, there's a fun little anecdote of Walter. I mentioned earlier that I don't think they were very religious, and this quote is my reasoning for that. A human family was a good thing to learn about. I'd seen Prince Jake's family, and now I was seeing Cassie's family. They are different in some ways. For example, Prince Jake's family performs a brief religious ritual before they eat. Cassie's family does not. It's not absolute certainty that they're not religious, because I don't think you necessarily need to do religious rituals before every meal to be considered religious, but I think it's an indicator that they probably aren't religious, at least not to that degree. You know, that like Bible thumping degree. Or blowing yourself up in a city centre degree. Last one then, last miscellaneous detail, it's a very special skill that he's got. Her dad had gone out to where the trough was and found Cassie's favourite mare wandering around outside the fence, scratched up, wet, with its saddle over one side. Her dad knows wild animals. He found the bear tracks. He followed the horse and bear tracks until it got too dark to see. You've got to remember, this is in woodlands as well, like forest. So the path isn't clear. So it's not like it's sand. Oh look, there's the trail. There it goes. No, it's not like that. So he's obviously got some skill in being able to track wild animals. He's like looking through the undergrowth, says, right, that looks like a track there, it's leading that way. So yeah, he's got some nature skills. Good on him. But now we've covered the miscellaneous details. Let's look at Walter in terms of the Animorphs story. Now, I've mentioned it briefly already, but up until book 49, Walter is little more than an obstacle. You'll have noticed that in various parts of these quotes, it's all Walter finding the Animorphs while they're in the barn or in and around the barn. And yeah, he is basically an obstacle. Very little more than. Where the Animorphs use the barn, but sometimes they have to go somewhere else, or sometimes they have to hide from him as he comes into the barn. You know, it's just a little game. Therefore, he really isn't a character for those first 48 books. He is a tool. A tool. But in book 49, he becomes more than that. Because this is the book where the Yeerks find out who the Animorphs are via the use of DNA. And of course, they find the DNA and they find, right, families. So the Yeerks go after the Animorphs' families, and the Animorphs say, we have to get our families out of here. And the animals are actually in the barn while they're discussing this. She waved her hand toward the animals. Who's going to take care of these guys? If my dad's not here, they have zero chance of survival. She closed her eyes. My dad? He doesn't have a clue what's coming. This is where Cassie is basically saying what we're going to do about these animals, but it's not long after this conversation that they agree we need to get the parents out of here. And because they're at Cassie's barn, the first parents will be Cassie's parents. And Cassie's mother is first because she's out on the porch, and then Walter comes out onto the porch, and this is what happens. The kitchen door slid open. Cassie's father stumbled out onto the porch, clutching a coffee mug in both hands. I want to know whose brilliant idea it was to schedule sunrise at... Whoa. He stared at Axe, rubbed his eyes and stared again, frowned and peered down into his mug. It's not the coffee, Walter. Sit down, Cassie said. Both of you. She led her mother up onto the porch and planted both her parents in chairs. And then she did an amazing impression of a wolf. I mentioned that I think this is when Walter actually becomes a character of his own. And suitably, this is the first time he's actually named. He wasn't actually known as Walter until now. That was the first time his name was mentioned. Before that, he was just Cassie's dad, Cassie's father. Only now was he named. His name was given as Walter. Of course, we don't know his last name. We don't even know Cassie's last name. So, yeah, Walter it now is. And Cassie morphs in front of them. So what happens after that? Her father wrapped his arms around them both. Why didn't you tell us, Cassie? We could have helped. I wanted to keep you safe for as long as possible. Cassie shook her head. But I can't anymore. The Yerks are closing in. We have to leave. You, me, all of us. Now. Now? Her mother held Cassie's face between her hands. Baby, I can't just leave my job, my house, and go running off who knows where. I have responsibilities. No, Mum, you don't. You only have your life and your family. And if you stay here, you'll lose them both. Cassie turned to her father. Daddy, you believe me, don't you? I believe you, Cassie. But your mother's right. We can't just leave. Too many people, too many animals depend on us. No, Cassie repeated firmly. Not anymore. You don't understand. So I find this part particularly telling. Cassie's mother says, we need to stay here because we've got all these things to protect, jobs, house, responsibility, animals, and so on. And Cassie says that doesn't matter. The only thing that matters now is us as a family, so we've got to get out of here. Do you believe me, Dad? Yes. But no. Yes, but whatever your mother just said. Again, is it just him simping for Michelle? I don't think so. I believe it's lip service, isn't it? Cassie says, the only thing that matters is us. Do you believe me, Dad? I believe you. But these things also matter as well. Yeah, it is lip service, isn't it? And it seems to fit nicely with his character that we know. I can't explain how, but it just seems to. We know how naive they are, and that becomes more apparent later on. And it just seems to be that they can't get into their heads that all these other things don't matter anymore. They just can't. It just doesn't compute. So even when he thinks he believes Cassie, he doesn't actually know. He doesn't know what he's saying he agrees to. But yeah, they struggle to convince Cassie's parents, the animals. But then one of the Chi comes along, Mr. King, or the Chi that is disguised as Mr. King, and shows them a hologram of nasty, naughty things happening. Mr. King maintained the large hologram of Cassie's yard and barn, but inside it he projected another hologram, one only those of us on the porch could see. A 3D movie of one of our old battles. Images flashed. Cassie in wolf morph, mangled and bleeding. A human controller, a cop firing on her. Cassie jerking, falling, lying in a bloody, lifeless heap. The images stopped. For a moment there was silence. Then Cassie's dad spoke. We need to leave, he said. Now. His wife nodded. Seeing this image of Cassie being shot in a Yerk battle, you know, this big horrible battle going on, It then dawns on them, oh, okay, hold on, she's not making this up. There is actually this awful war going on. And the daughter's involved. So that is when the reality first starts kicking in. It doesn't fully kick in yet, but it's at that point where they decide, okay, maybe we should just listen to what is being said here. Maybe there are more important things than the barn at this point. So they effectively abandon the barn. The Chi do say that they'll look after the animals, but yeah, the barn it's history now. They're then whisked away to the Hortbajir Valley, where the Hortbajir build them a cabin. I soared out over the valley, over the 3 Hortbajir who were scurrying around like carpenter ants, helping Marco's dad build cabins for Cassie's and Rachel's families. Now that Cassie's parents are in the Hortbajir Valley, living amongst the animals, now is when we start to see Walter as a character be used in an effective way for the series. And how I see it is Cassie's parents, both of them, Walter and Michelle, are basically versions of Cassie from the start of the series. They are incredibly naive. Incredibly. And let's have a look at a couple of quotes now where that naivete comes to the forefront. There are other Visses? My dad asked hopefully. Would it be possible to tell Visser 1 will negotiate, but not with him? Eva smiled slightly, glanced at Jake, then back to my dad. I don't mean to sound condescending, Walter, she said, but you have no idea who you're dealing with. If we approach Visser 1 for any reason, he'll kill us. Period. If we're lucky. If he stops to think, he'll probably torture us first. Just in case we've been holding back any useful information. Finally, my dad spoke up. What do they want? These Yerks? Cassie, surely they can be reasoned with. Most people can. What can we give them that would satisfy them? Our souls, Jake answered quietly. The first words he had spoken all night. If they don't already have them. Walter is very much like Cassie at the start of the series. It's all about negotiating, reasoning with them. Surely they will reason with us. They've got the sense of humanity that if we just come to them and say, please, compromise, they will say, yes, of course. It's not that way. And he does have a point. Right, let's get this straight. The reason that the Yerk War ended is it's basically when they do negotiate on the pool ship. Jake negotiates with... Oh no, was it? It was Toby negotiated with a sub-visser because Esplin had basically been captured, but the Yerk forces were still on the ship, and Toby negotiated with the sub-visser in charge of what remained on the ship and said, we'll give you the morphing power. So it was Toby that negotiated, which meant that the sub-visser basically then surrendered. So they could be reasoned with, but why were they reasoned with? Why was it possible to reason with them? It's because they lost their advantage. So Walter is half right. Pretty much anybody can be reasoned with and compromised with, unless they're like complete psychopaths, like people with no... How would you call it? They are just completely lost in the head, like there's nothing really going on properly in there. Those people you can't reason with, like actual psychopaths. But most, to say 99.5% of people, can be reasoned with, but not all the time. Walter's naivety, and by an extension Michelle's as well, though not quite as prominent, it is mostly Walter at this point. His naivety comes from thinking that power isn't at play here, that power isn't a deciding factor in how these factions interact with each other. So the Yerks under Visser 1 will feel that they have the most power. They have the advantage in this fight. As soon as Visser 1 is gone, and they've lost that, and they've lost their advantage, then they come to the negotiating table. It happens all the bloody time in wars. If someone's winning, they will not negotiate. They will not compromise. Why would they? They're winning. Why would they give things away when they can have it all? So Walter is half right. They can be reasoned with, but they could only do that if they gained the advantage. That's what Walter was missing. He doesn't think in those terms. He's not in that mental space. And that is very much like Cassie in the early books, but to an even more exaggerated degree, I would say. But they are basically exaggerated versions of Cassie. He comes across the Animorphs later on in book 50, The Ultimate, when they're discussing giving the power to morph to disabled children. And of course, he is not happy. My dad had stepped forward out of the shadows. I couldn't sleep, so I got up to get some air, he said. And I couldn't help but overhear your conversation. His face was gaunt and haggard in the pre-dawn light. He seemed to have aged 10 years in the last 24 hours. Dad looked at me for a long time. I can't bear to describe the expression on his face. He was looking at me like I was the enemy. Like he suddenly understood that evil existed not just in the world, not just in his own backyard, but in his very own kid. His very own flesh and blood. Please tell me I misunderstood, he said. Please tell me you haven't actually convinced disabled children to participate in this nightmare. Jake spoke. We had no choice. There's always a choice, my father said angrily. Jake, I thought you knew that. Where's the boy I used to know? The boy who was so clear on right and wrong? We'll wait for you over there, Jake told me. He didn't answer my father. He just led Toby and the others away. Dad, I said, I don't have time to argue ethics with you. I don't have time to convince you that sometimes you have to do something uncomfortable to make things right in the end. This is war. Every minute counts. We're fighting to save the human race. The human race? My father repeated. Okay, answer me this, Cassie. Is what you're doing with these disabled children humane? My father sounded like me. Like the old me. But I wasn't that naive person anymore. I had no answer. I turned and walked away. Started to morph Osprey. Cassie! He cried. Cassie! Wait! But I didn't wait. I finished the morph and flew. This is quite a hard-hitting point in it. So Walter has overheard them talk about giving the power to morph to disabled kids and basically enlisting them to fight this war. And he is absolutely distraught by this. He sees this as some great betrayal by his own daughter. He comes up to her and says, oh, what are you doing? This is like evil and stuff, you know. It's crazy. But Jake is the first to say to him, look, he doesn't even say anything. He listens to Walter give him this speech, and then he just says, he doesn't even say anything. He just turns and says, right, Toby, let's go. And goes away. Runs off. He doesn't even pay attention. Probably because he's heard it all before, and he doesn't want it to affect his thinking, because he knows that he cannot listen to Walter. That if he listens to Walter, they're going to lose. So why even just let it go over your head and walk away and just carry on what you're doing. But then what's interesting is that Cassie does the exact same thing. She does respond to him, says, look, this is war, that you don't even understand what's going on. He tries, he continues, and she does exactly the same thing as Jake. Thinks, you don't get it. You're just adding unnecessary doubt to my head. And I can't do that anymore. I can't have that doubt blocking what needs to go on up here. And she flies away as well, which must be absolutely not good for Walter at all. Because he's seeing his child do what he thinks is completely unjustified and evil and horrible, which to a degree it is. It's understandable as well, sort of. Not very, but sort of. There is another part in The Ultimate as well where Walter comes in. They're all sitting around a campfire, and this is before the incident where they're talking about the disabled kids, by the way. They're sitting around a campfire and they're discussing their plans. And then Walter turns it into an emotional moment and almost breaks the spirit of the team. Eva shook her head. There's only one enemy Visser one respects and fears. And that's Jake. He needs to be our leader. My father spoke up. Even if he can do the job, he shouldn't be expected to. It's an enormous burden. It isn't fair to ask him. I looked at Jake. He looked like he was about to cry. My father stood, walked to Jake's side, and put his hand on his shoulder. I don't understand all of this, Jake. I don't really know what happened to your parents, but until they come back, well, I want you to consider yourself part of our family. Jake's mouth went tight. Yes, he was going to cry. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. If Jake lost it, I'd lose it. We'd all lose it. We'd all just break down into sobbing, screaming, guilt-ridden, terrified group. This moment comes across as very Disney-like, but it sort of turns it on its head. Where Walter comes up and says to Jake, you don't need to do this and you could be part of our family, you know. It's an unnecessarily sappy thing at a very inappropriate time, and it almost pushes Jake over the edge. And though his intention may have been very good and a loving thing to say, it could have been the end from their perspective of just the complete breakdown of morale. But Jake did hold firm in the end. But Walter didn't need to say that. But he thinks he ought to say that when it was probably the most inappropriate thing to say at the time. He's still in that world of, you know, we just got to, spread the love and all that sort of stuff. But they're deep, deep, deep into the middle of a war. They're in a war zone, effectively. They're in a camp. And at a critical breaking point. And the last thing Jake needed at that point was that little speech and that little bit of doubt where Walter says, you don't need to do this. You shouldn't be expected to do this. When all along he has been doing it. And this is crunch time. And for Walter to come up and say, you don't need to do this. It is almost that morale destroying moment. But Jake thankfully manages to hold on. And again, this is no fault of Walter's. He just doesn't know where he is or what he's doing. He's just a bit hopeless. But we get past this part. And Walter's next action is that he joins the Animals as they're fetching bombs from a military base which will be used to destroy the Yurt Ball. And he is the one, suitably enough, driving the truck. Just like his old pickup. The Hork-Bajir jumped into the trucks on top of the crates. Rachel climbed in next to her mother. I squeezed in next to Rachel and slammed the door shut. In the cargo area, Lauren and Eva perched precariously. Marco, Cassie and Jake jammed themselves into the second truck with Michelle. Cassie's dad took the wheel. So Walter's last major action is, of course, to be in the front of a truck driving. He's probably got the CD in. He's probably got Stevie Wonder playing in this in this truck as well. Good on you, Walter. He was an effective unit in the battle against the Yerks at the end, despite his inexperience, his naivety. But what is the very last thing he does in the series? It is this bit here. This is the last time we ever hear him mentioned. Marco shook his head. He'll think we're cocky after taking out the Yurt Pool. Maybe he'll underestimate us. No, Eva said flatly. He'll never underestimate you again. That's over. It's too dangerous, Cassie's dad said. He was sipping a cup of what passed for coffee here in our rough and ready camp. That last little bit is just a nice summary of the Walter we know. You know, a bit of doubt thrown in there. You know, even though he used to be all happy, smiley, we can do all this. He's now at that stage, he's in the middle of a war and he said, that's too dangerous. You shouldn't do that. It's far too dangerous for you. Which comes back to his protective nature. Of course, they don't listen to him, really. But he's sitting there with his rough and ready coffee that he's made probably from tree bark, made by the cut from the Hork-Bajir. And yeah, always with the coffee cup in hand, Walter's here to save the day. Thank you, Walter, for your involvement in the series. So let's summarise Walter, shall we? He is basically a nothing character for the first 48 books, where his role is basically to be the guy who owns the place where the animals have most of their meetings, and sometimes to be the guy who would sometimes sneak in and the animals would have to go somewhere else or hide or whatever. He is basically a plot device, effectively, and of course a parent of one of the animorphs. Yeah, that's all he is. Book 49 comes along. Oh, by the way, his pickup truck is a major character. Probably even a more major character than Walter is in those first 48 books. But we'll get into that as a separate analysis. Book 49 comes along and Walter develops a character. Although it's more of a rehashing of the old Cassie from like the first 20 or so books of the Animal series. Where we've got Cassie of book 50, around book 50, and she's seeing herself and her parents from back then. Their naivety, their inexperience, this constant need to find a middle ground where sometimes that middle ground cannot be found because you don't have the advantage, you don't have the power to go to the negotiating table, but they just don't understand that. They've lived a largely sheltered life, which is strange considering that they spend all their lives around wounded animals. It is very strange that somebody who spends their lives around people or creatures who are not sheltered, who run risks every day and get wounded in ridiculous accidents, and then on the flip side they're an incredibly sheltered, protected people to the point where they just don't understand the real hostilities of the world. I think there is a big irony in that, and it is very interesting. He acts as a bit of a foil, especially in book 50, for the Animorphs, who are pushing forward with these rather extreme plans, getting more extreme by the day, and Walter is there to basically play the old Cassie role of, hey, why are we doing this? He basically is the new Cassie once book 50 comes along. We don't know what happens to Walter after the war. We can be absolutely certain that he survived because it's not something you'd forget to mention in book 54 if Walter suddenly died. So he probably survived. Whether, I think, because the town was largely destroyed, would he have stayed in the town? I think the town was pretty much a write-off, largely, so he probably had to move. Cassie, I believe, moved to Wyoming to be near the Hertfordshire. If not, she lived in California but frequently went back and forth to Wyoming. My idea is that she moved to Wyoming, and her parents probably weren't far behind her. They wouldn't have moved to the same house, but they would have probably gone to be in proximity to her. So they probably would have moved, if not upstate into like northern California, then they probably would have moved a bit eastward, maybe Idaho or something like that. Somewhere around that area. I can't, it's all speculation, but it's just because they are protective parents, aren't they? So they're not just going to let Cassie go off on her own and not think, our town is bombed, so we need to move. They're not going to think, how far from Cassie can we get? They're going to say, well, we're going to stay near to you. That just seems to be the way I think it is. So my speculation is Walter and Michelle obviously survived the war, and I'm going to say they moved to Idaho, or maybe like Jackson in Wyoming, like one of the bigger areas there, near to Cassie, and they open up a new rehabilitation clinic. Maybe Michelle gets a job in a veterinary place over there. So basically they restart in a different location near where Cassie now lives, which I'm assuming is near or in Yellowstone, because that's where she does stuff with the Hertfordshire. And it's closer to DC, where apparently she's going to be spent. I don't know. That's for another video, isn't it? So thank you, Walter. I actually really appreciate Walter's part in the series. Even though for the first 48 books he's a bit part, you know, his truck still plays a massive part, his barn that he owns plays a huge part, and that all stems from him. And then when we get to the end game, he plays, I'd say, a pretty substantial role in the group as the foil, as the one who's trying to hold them back in the way that Cassie used to. So, Walter, I think you're an excellent addition to this series. I really appreciate your involvement. Go listen to your Stevie Wonder, get into your new pickup truck and drive into the sunset in Wyoming. And continue doing your wildlife rehabilitation clinic for many days to come. Thank you very much, Walter, and thank you, AniLysis fans, as well, for tuning into this video. It's been another long one. Not as bad as the Tom one or the Hortbajir one in terms of length and research. Amount of research. Let's see what we've got next for AniLysis 76. What's it going to be? I've nearly finished listening to audiobook 23, but I haven't finished it yet, so I haven't added book 23's possible AniLysis videos onto this list yet. So we're still looking at books 1 through the Hortbajir Chronicles. What's it gonna be? Spin diddly, spin diddly, spin dindaloo. What's it gonna be? It'll be only you. The Makora home planet. Okay, that's going to be a short one. Right. Yeah, small one. Let's go. Tune in for that one. Or I'll bash you. Like, so hard that you get a big bruise. And it's all horrible and green and brown and stuff. And it's really off-putting to people who see it. And then they won't want to be friends with you anymore because they'll just call you Bruise Boy. They'll call you Bruise Boy and they'll say, he's got bruises. Something wrong with him. Yeah, that's what they're going to call you for the rest of your days. Bruise Boy. Bruise Boy. And then they'll start calling you Patch. Call you Patch. So you've got patches of bruises. Then they'll start beating you, saying, where's your bruise gone? We need to put your bruise back on. Where's your bruise gone, Bruce? Where's your bruise gone, Patches? And they'll punch you. And it'll bloody well hurt. It will. Patches. That's what they call you. Tune in for the next AniLysis, which is going to be on the Makora home planet. And else it'll be somewhere else in the AniLysis universe, just like we will be somewhere else in the AniLysis universe. See you then, everybody. Cheerio, Patches.